parties listed in Annex 1, which I shall refer to as Annex 1 parties. The main obligations under the Framework Convention concerning mitigation are to be found in Article 4, Paragraph 1. The Court observes that certain obligations under this provision, such as those to develop, update, publish, and make available national inventories of anthropogenic GHG emissions and removals by sinks, the obligation to formulate and publish national programs, and the obligation to communicate information to the COP are obligation of result. Other obligations under Article 4, Paragraph 1 are obligation of conduct because they do not require parties to bring about a particular result, but rather require parties to use their best efforts to achieve certain results relating to mitigation. In the Court's view, the obligations under Article 4, Paragraph 1 are interconnected obligations of conduct and result. The Court further observes that Article 4, Paragraph 2 sets forth a number of distinct but interrelated mitigation obligations that are legally binding for Annex 1 parties. The Court finds it necessary to recall that all obligations identified are legally binding upon the parties to which they pertain, regardless of whether the obligation in question is one of result or one of conduct. As the Court has observed, the distinction between obligation of conduct and obligation of result is not necessarily a strict one. It must be stressed that both types of obligations may result in the responsibility of a state for breach of the relevant obligation. With regard to adaptation obligations under the Framework Convention, the Court observes that adapting to the adverse effects of climate change is, along with mitigation, a major area of action for parties under the Framework Convention. Several provisions of the Framework Convention refer to obligations relating to adaptation. These provisions, like all provisions in Article 4, Paragraph 1, are introduced with the term shall and are legally binding in nature. While the aforementioned obligations pertain to all parties, Article 4, Paragraph 4 of the Framework Convention provides that Annex 2 parties shall assist the developing country parties that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change in meeting the costs of adaptation to those diverse effects. This is a legally binding obligation on all parties that are listed in Annex 2. The Court further observes that the Framework Convention establishes an obligation for parties to cooperate in different areas, including in mitigation and adaptation. The Court considers that international cooperation is indispensable in the field of climate change, and that the customary duty to cooperate for the protection of the environment is reflected in several provisions of the climate change treaties. The duty to cooperate is an obligation of conduct, the fulfillment of which is assessed against a standard of due diligence. The Court then turns to the Kyoto Protocol, to the Framework Convention. The Court notes that the absence of a new commitment period after 2020 does not deprive the Kyoto Protocol of its legal effect. Kyoto Protocol remains in force, and the provisions may still serve as inter alia, 1, interpretative aids for the identification of the obligations under the Climate Change Treaty Framework, and 2, substantive provisions to assess the compliance of Annex B parties with applicable emission reduction targets, i.e., to determine whether a state during the relevant commitment period has complied with its emission reduction commitments. Thus, non-compliance with emission reduction commitments by a state may constitute an internationally wrongful act. The Court then addresses the obligation of state parties to the Paris Agreement. As a general matter, the Court notes that while the Paris Agreement provides for limiting the global average temperature increase to well below 2 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial levels as a goal, and to 1.5 degrees Celsius as an additional effort, 1.5 degrees Celsius has become the scientifically based consensus target under the Paris Agreement. In this connection, the Court refers to decisions of the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement. In the Court's view, these decisions express the agreement in substance between the parties regarding the interpretation of Articles 2 and 4 of the Paris Agreement, and thus constitute
others, the Vienna Convention and the Montreal Protocol. To explain why this is a win, kung nanalo yung argument ng mga big countries na UNFCCC at Paris Agreement lang yung applicable